Pendejo que no guachas los puestos del gobierno. Hay personas que se están enriqueciendo. Gente que vive en la pobreza.
Welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. We're glad you joined us today. It is Thursday, July 11th, 2019, and we are live from the studios here in Redway, California, KMUD. Thank you so much again for joining us. I'd like to mention the shows will be archived as always here at kmud.org, but we now have a dedicated website. I'm Mary Massey, along here with John Sakowicz.
Good morning, Mary.
Yeah,
good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audience here in Northern California and streaming on the web throughout the country and throughout the world.
I want to mention, John, on our website that you are going to be writing a regular blog, and folks can get in touch with us through email. That's going to be possible. We will write to you. All of our programs will be archived in a YouTube video format. There will be a link. And we also will have the opportunity for you to listen to KMUD live right from our website. So we are very excited to launch that this week.
What's the website called?
Yes, thank you. www.heroespatriots.org.
Couldn't be simpler.
Yes. So let's get started with today's program. In recent events, Iran has announced it has enriched uranium to more than 3.67% purity, breaking the limit set by the 2015 nuclear deal with the United States. And also, Putin has pulled out of the INF nuclear treaty that Trump abandoned this past February. And I understand, John, there's been some recent overnight events that we want our first guest, Dr. Francis Boyle, to speak with us. So without further ado, welcome to Francis Boyle.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, and my best to your listening audience.
Thank you.
So, let's do a little intro to Francis Boyle because, man, I love you, Francis Boyle. You've been one of our most popular guests over the years as we've transited through a number of public radio stations and here now at KMUD in Northern California, a great station. You're a top constitutional lawyer. You have done very controversial things and very important things, like to offer to represent pro bono any member of Congress who would have offered a motion to impeach Bush back in the day. That's when I first noticed you, and most recently you've been quoted in the Wall Street Journal. You're really a top guest. So thank you for being on the show once again. Let's do a quick update. It looks like America is really itching for a fight with Iran. You have maybe a false flag attack on those two oil tankers last month. You have overnight. You have 5 armed boats belonging to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps trying to unsuccessfully seize a British oil tanker in the Persian Gulf after the British had detained an Iranian oil tanker in Gibraltar on suspicion that was carrying crude oil to Syria in violation of EU sanctions. And you also have an overnight news, the United States calling for an emergency meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna in response to the Iranian moves the charge by the United States that Iran is using quote-unquote nuclear extortion. It seems like we're going down the path to war. What say you? And put it in historical context. How does the United States how have they made the pretext for war with false flag attacks in the past?
Well, John, I think you are correct that we are moving towards war with Iran, and I'm afraid everyone's going to have to do something to stop it here. Indeed, as you know, 2 weeks ago, it appears that a drone and a PC Orion were deliberately sent, with a crew of 27, by the way, were deliberately sent into Iranian airspace where they could have been shot down. And fortunately, the Iranians only shot down the drone. If they had shot down that PC Orion with its crew of 27, there would have been a declaration of war by Congress, and we would be at war today with Iran. I kid you not. So it's a very dangerous situation. It appears from all the reports that it was Bolton and Pompeo who were encouraging President Trump to launch a retaliatory attack on Iran. Bolton, as you know, is a neoconservative, longtime neoconservative operative and warmonger. About my age, Yale Law School. Pompeo, again, a neoconservative Federalist Society, Koch brothers guy, behind me at Harvard Law School. And at the last minute, it appears President Trump called that strike off, which obviously, in my opinion, at some point just would have degenerated into outright warfare. I mean, it might have started as a limited strike, but given the circumstances on both sides, it probably would have degenerated into outright warfare. And I believe Bolton understood that. You can't underestimate Bolton. He's a sharp guy, and he knows exactly what he is doing here. Remember, he was a neocon who worked for Reagan, and then he worked for Bush Jr. So he knows exactly what he is doing here and what the history is here. So that failed. And so now I believe Bolton and Pompeo are sort of regrouping, as it were, to create a new pretext for hostilities against Iran that they know full well will degenerate into outright warfare. So we have the seizure of the Iranian oil tanker there in the Mediterranean by the British, undoubtedly at our request.
Right.
There was no authorization from the United Nations Security Council to do this. Basically, it's an act of piracy, although technically, under the technical definition of piracy, it might not qualify, but that's pretty much what happened. So it does appear yesterday Iran tried to seize a British tanker there in the Strait of Hormuz, and a British warship and an American plane were there. So it does appear that we're seeing steps taken by the Trump administration under Bolton and Pompeo to move us into an outbreak of hostilities with Iran that eventually will culminate in a full-fledged war. As you know, Pompeo is now going around to set up this so-called Operation Sentinel,
Right.
To allegedly escort ships, oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. This is exactly what happened back during the Reagan administration, where, as you may recall, it was President Carter and his national security advisor, Brzezinski, who was ahead of me in the PhD program at Harvard, who encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade and attack Iran. And there was a terrible war there, massive casualties all up and down, and Iran turned the tide, and there was a tanker war, and we, the Reagan administration, entered the tanker war on behalf of Saddam Hussein. And that eventually led to hostilities between the United States and Iran, culminating in the shoot-down of the Vincennes by the Vincennes of this Iran Airbus. So Bolton is fully aware of this history, and it looks as if they're trying to set up a similar type of scenario where there would be small-scale hostilities between the United States and Iran that unfortunately could very easily degenerate into a full-scale war. At least, John, that's my reading of the situation as of today in good faith. Obviously, it's a difficult situation to look at and evaluate. If you are interested in my book, Destroying World Order,
Yes.
I have a whole chapter in there on the Iraq-Iran war and the tanker wars with footnotes that substantiate what I'm talking to you today.
Yeah, I don't think we did your introduction justice. And not only are you a highly regarded author, including books Destroying the World Order, but you're also a professor of international law at the University of Illinois and a constitutional law expert. In that regard, as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, you were the lead author of a bill for impeachment put forward by Representative Henry Gonzalez in 1991 against George H.W. Bush, who later wrote that very fear of impeachment prevented him from a full-scale invasion of Iraq. What are the possibilities for filing articles of impeachment against Bolton? He seems to be again just out of his mind with aggression towards Iran. I don't know whether he's doing the bidding for Israel or what the hidden agenda is, but is there any inclination by any member of Congress, like AOC or anyone else, that they would be interested in filing for articles of impeachment against Bolton?
Right, John. I've already put out a press release on that, I guess, shortly after the shoot down of the drone and the decision by Trump not to attack, calling for articles of impeachment against Bolton to get him out of there. And I have given some interviews to that effect, but so far I haven't heard. I've offered to work with any member of the U.S. House of Representatives willing to do that free of charge, because Bolton's going to get us into a war here. That's for sure, if he is not stopped and knocked out of there. And I think a bill of impeachment, the Democrats control the House. They could impeach Bolton tomorrow, send it to the Senate, and that might be the end of Bolton right there. Who knows? But it could stop the momentum towards war that we're seeing right now and today in the morning's news programs, where you saw the British ship and the U.S. Aircraft over there and the Iranian Guard boats right there in the Strait of Hormuz. It's an extremely dangerous situation that can easily be ignited by Bolton and Pompeo. Also, we know one other thing that's extremely dangerous. As you know, when President Trump was in Japan, someone in the White House ordered the crew of the McCain, the warship, to cover up the name and to block the name.
Right.
Well, that's a serious problem there, because someone in the White House then jumped the entire military chain of command to be issuing orders directly to U.S. Armed Forces. We haven't had a confirmed Secretary of Defense there since Mattis. Right now, it's acting. So my concern here is that someone in the White House like Bolton might be issuing direct orders and just skipping the military chain of command. So I don't know about that. Although the new acting Secretary Esper, he went to West Point with Bolton. They're good buddies, and Esper also worked for the Heritage Foundation, which, as you know, is a gang of neoconservative warmongers there. So we're in, John. I'm afraid dire straits here.
Right. I want to mention that if you've just joined the program, we are taking listener calls at 707-923-3911 at 14 minutes past the hour. And if you've just joined the program, you are hearing international law expert, Dr. Francis A. Boyle. He is joining us live from Chicago. And if we might, let's talk about Russia's role with relation to Iran and how you see perhaps things playing out or what's happening with Trump's foreign policy in regard to those two entities.
Well, again, that's another very complicated issue. To be honest with you, and here, let me just point out, I had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, I spent 10 years studying everything about Russia and the Soviet Union at the University of Chicago and Harvard, two of the world's leading centers for training experts on the Soviet Union and Russia. And that culminated in my taking and passing my Harvard PhD oral exams in Russian history and Soviet politics, which qualified me to teach Harvard undergraduates. Now, I'm not here to defend President Trump one way or the other. I am simply trying to be objective about it. But I have not seen this so-called evidence that Trump is a Manchurian candidate or a stooge for Putin or anything at all like that. And I want to make clear, I did not vote for Trump. I did not vote for Mrs. Clinton. I voted for a third-party candidate. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to be, as I see it, objective here. And it appears that this strategy was adopted by the Democrats shortly after Trump was nominated for the Republican presidential candidacy and was pushed by Mrs. Clinton and the Democratic Party and the Democratic-related news media. And that's pretty much been the case since then. So it has really set back. Well, I wouldn't say set back because, Obama, you have to understand, Obama, his mentor was Zbigniew Brzezinski, okay? And I went through that exact same PhD program at Harvard that produced Brzezinski before me. Mm-hmm. Brzezinski is an expatriate Pole who hates Russians with a passion and wrote his book, The Geopolitical Chessboard, calling for Russia to be cracked up into its constituent units. So we had under Obama and the Democrats an extremely harsh, punitive policy towards Russia that Mrs. Clinton was continuing. Indeed, Brzezinski, after he ran Obama's campaign on foreign affairs and defense matters, and then stacked Obama's administration with his proteges. So we were in very dire straits again toward the end of the Obama term with respect to Russia. Candidate Trump said he wanted better relations with Russia. But again, the Democrats and the Democrat-related news media beat up on him on this, and using what I believe to be these phony Russiagate charges against him. And now even Mueller, in Volume 1 of his report, concluded there was nothing there. And I don't believe there was anything there to begin with. It was a tactic. Mrs. Clinton was appealing to the military, to the CIA, to the military-industrial complex. And that's where we are with Russia. Now, President Trump had this recent meeting with Putin. I would hope something positive would come about that. They have set up a committee to talk about the various sources of dispute we have. John had mentioned the repudiation of the INF Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what Bolton's doing. And we pulled out of the INF Treaty, and Russia responded in kind. They've pulled out. That will be effective in August. It's an extremely dangerous situation. Russia has said that if we start to deploy INFs in Europe, they'll do the same. Bolton knows this. He was around under Reagan for the INF Treaty. Bolton's against any type of arms control, arms limitation agreements with Russia. So I don't know what will happen, but it's a negative sign that apparently the INF Treaty is going to die unless these new negotiations can somehow revive them, postpone the mutual withdrawal, and then there is a standing consultative committee that is supposed to deal with compliance issues, and it seems to me that's where these matters should be dealt with while the INF treaty is extended. But again, with Bolton in there, I don't really see at the end of the day this happening, because I'm afraid Bolton will sabotage this, just as he almost got us war with Iran. Likewise, President Trump had lined up the Hanoi Agreement with Kim Jong-un, North Korea, which seemed to be a very positive step forward in establishing peaceful relations between the United States and North Korea, and at least taking a step towards the denuclearization of North Korea, as they had agreed in their Singapore declaration. But all the reports are that Bolton and Pompeo sabotaged that Hanoi agreement. So now we have President Trump just meeting with Kim Jong-un there at the DMZ and saying they're going to reopen negotiations. But the problem is, again, Pompeo is in charge of the negotiations, and the negotiator, Biden, reports to Pompeo. And in addition, then Bolton is still there in the White House, and I suspect he'll be working behind the scenes to sabotage whatever he can. I mean, Bolton's a very canny operative there in the U.S. Bureaucracy, the U.S. government bureaucracy. So there we are on that.
Yeah, we have it on very strong, on a very strong source through our own intelligence networks. That with regard to these negotiations that started yesterday at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, that the French presidential envoy Emmanuel Bon met with key Iranian figures, chief among them Ali Shabkani, head of Iran's National Security Council, who reiterated that Iran's decision to reduce its nuclear commitment step by step is unchanging. They're committed to it. So with that being the case,
John, let me respond to that, because it's important here. Bolton got Trump to repudiate the JCPOA with Iran that had been negotiated by Obama.
right?
And that's one thing I'm trying to be fair here. Obama was behind me at Harvard Law School. I believe the JCPOA was a very significant and important agreement. And in fact, I read the entire JCPOA. I remember when it was announced, there were dueling press conferences by Secretary of State Kerry and also Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif. And they were describing two different treaties, as far as I could tell. And I thought, well, one of them is lying. It's either Kerry, who went to Boston College Law School, first-rate law school, or Zarif, who was educated, I believe, at I think it was the University of Denver, where he got his PhD. One of them is lying. So when I sat down and read the JCPOA, I concluded that and I'm not a supporter of Secretary of State Kerry, but I concluded that everything Secretary of State Kerry said about that JCPOA was correct.
Mm-hmm.
I also listened to the press conference by Secretary of Energy Moniz, who had been from MIT, and everything Moniz said about that JCPOA is correct. So this was in my opinion, a great victory for American diplomacy. And your viewers, your listeners can just go back and get those press conferences by Kerry and Moniz. And I'm just telling you, having read the documents, I agree with what they're saying. So there was no cause for Trump to repudiate the JCPOA at all. And that's where we are now. That was Bolton's doing. We know that Sheldon Adelson, the big casino magnate out there in Nevada, was basically pushing Trump to get Bolton in there, and contributed millions of dollars to the Trump campaign and the Republican Party to get that job done. So there we are.
So, Professor, our time is running short, so I want to leave us with your answer to the big question. Motive. Why? Why is Bolton moving down the path to war? Why are we doing this? Why are we falsely accusing Iran of nuclear extortion? Why are we making the case for a Persian Gulf of Tonkin? My personal view is that war is a business. Our second guest today is Dave Lindorff, who is going to be speaking about the Pentagon's massive accounting scandal. Hundreds of billions of dollars are missing at the Pentagon. War is a business. General Smedley Butler said it best. War is a racket. It's the best business there is, and America has been exporting war, if you will, ever since World War II. So my theory is that we're picking a fight with Iran simply because we need to be in another war. The military-industrial complex needs another war. What do you say? What's your opinion?
Well, that's correct, but also the massive quantities of gas and oil in the Persian Gulf. And right now, Iran is the only holdout there that isn't doing what we tell them to do. We have to go back to Gulf War I by Bush Sr., which, as you correctly pointed out, Congressman Henry B. Gonzalez and I and Ramsey Clark tried to stop with that impeachment campaign. It was all about control and domination of the oil and gas of the Persian Gulf. Not that we need it ourselves, but this is all the oil and gas for Europe, China, South Korea, India. It's like 30% or more of the world's supply. So, we will have them all by the neck. But Iran is the only holdout now after, 2 wars by the Bushes. They're the only holdout to our complete domination and control of the Persian Gulf and all the oil and gas.
Francis Boyle, how can folks follow you, look at your writings, your book you mentioned earlier? How can they get in touch? What information would you like to give?
Well, you could just Google my name, and my books come up in my activities. I wouldn't have believed Wikipedia. That was started by a disgruntled student who set out to trash me, and they never corrected it, so fine.
Oh, no.
Google is Google, and my newest book is Poems Against the Empire, Setia Publishing. My reflections in poetry of the past 50 years fighting against the American empire since I was a young man opposing the Vietnam War.
Wonderful. We hope folks will take advantage of getting that book.
Francis, I want to thank you again for being on our show. I'm actually thinking about buying 20 of your books or something along those lines, maybe to give out as a pledge drive incentive. When pledge drive rolls around, I think it would be a wonderful gift, and you speak wonderfully to the audience that we have here at KMUD. Thank you, my friend.
Well, thank you, guys. I do have 20 books, so I guess
okay. No, we'll talk off the air about this, because you're a great mind. You're a great American. Name of this show is Heroes and Patriots. You're one of my heroes, Mary's too, and a true American patriot. Keep up the fight, and I hope a member of Congress takes up your offer about filing for articles of impeachment against Bolton. Thank you so much, Francis.
Well, thanks again, Mary and John.
You bet. Have a great day. So it is 30 minutes now past the hour. You're listening to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. I did want to mention again that if you would like to speak to our next guest, David Lindorff, the number to call is 707-923-3911. Also, a program note, we have our own website that I'd like to refer our listeners to. You can reach us by email, follow John's blog, look at our past guests, hear archived programs, and join KMUD Live. So that website, again, is www.heroespatriots.org. We are now having David Lindorff join our program, and he is a journalist, an investigative journalist, an American, and John, you know him quite well, I think.
Sure. He's the founder of an independent, collectively run journalist news site, thiscan'tbehappening.net.
I love that name. This can't be happening.
Well, it is happening. As Francis Boyle, our last guest, pointed out, it's happening. The United States is moving down the path towards war with Iran, and my personal belief is that nothing short of impeachment against Bolton, our national security advisor, will stop this, or Pompeo, our Secretary of Defense. It's a crazy time here in the United States, and everything that we didn't think could be happening is happening. So again, I refer you to Dave Lindorff's site, thiscan'tbehappening.net, and in it he wrote an exclusive article about the Pentagon's massive accounting scandal.
Right.
And he exposes it. The Nation magazine's cover story picked it up. And earlier this year, Lindorff won the Izzy Award for Outstanding Independent Journalism from Park Center for Independent Media for uncovering the opaqueness of the Pentagon's accounts and bloated military budgets. Do we have him on the line yet?
No, we're still getting him on the line.
Still getting him on the line. So one of the things I want to point out, and for those of you who don't believe me, go do this research for yourself. The very day before 9/11, September 10th, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who's not known by any stretch of the imagination as a peace advocate or as a dove.
Right.
He's a warmonger, all right? During the Bush administration, very pro-war administration. But during the very day before 9/11, September 10th, Donald Rumsfeld declared war, not on terrorism, because the towers hadn't come down yet, but against widespread fraud in the Pentagon. He alleged that $1 out of every $3 of defense spending was lost due to waste, fraud, or corruption, amounting to over $1 trillion. This is an incredible scandal that never saw the light of day because the Twin Towers came down the very next day, and we transitioned immediately to the war on terror. With that, I want to introduce our next guest. Dave, are you with us?
I am. Hi.
Hi. Welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us.
So bring us up to speed. How big is the massive accounting scandal at the Pentagon?
Actually, it's so mammoth that the numbers are extraordinary. Mark Skidmore, who's a professor of accounting at the Southern Michigan University, there was he found $21 trillion when he and his two grad students looked at all the online audits done by over 20 years by the Office of Inspector General for the Pentagon, and that was they only audit or try to audit the one branch or one unit of the Pentagon each year. So if there's 21 trillion in these enormous numbers in their annual financial reports for one part of the Pentagon, it could be over $100 trillion in these numbers. But what I found out in my story is that, first of all, these numbers are liabilities and assets, and they tend to cancel each other out. And the other thing is that they're completely made up. They're made up by this army of accountants in Indiana at a military base that are in a unit called the Defense Accounting Financial Service, and they actually have a name for these numbers. They're called plugs, and it's not an accounting term, but it's a Pentagon term. They plug the numbers in, and what it manages to do is to make the Pentagon's financial statements each year completely and utterly fraudulent and impossible to decipher. So that's why when after 20 years or more, really 30 years of failing to comply with a congressional mandate that all federal agencies have auditable budgets, the Pentagon finally was subjected to, dragged kicking and streaming and subjected to an audit by 1,000 auditors from the big audit firms, Wall Street audit firms. When they reported on November 15th the results of their work, which was an enormously expensive job, they threw up their hands and said, "We can't do it. There's no reliable numbers. We can't rely on the prior year's figures. It can't be done." I'd been warned this was going to happen by a named person who is the director of National Security Asset Management at the GAO. He said that it's going to be a failure. He told me in September it's going to be a failure, and they won't be able to audit, even if under the best of circumstances, if they really wanted to be audited, the Pentagon couldn't be audited for 4 or 5 years because there's no track record of reliable numbers. Wow. So, Rumsfeld was right, and Rumsfeld, the quote you made from Rumsfeld is actually only part of what he said. Some of the other stuff he said was even more remarkable. He said that at that press conference, which was heavily attended and heavily reported on that night on the electronic media, he said that his people had found $2.3 trillion in financial transactions that could not be traced or accounted for, and he said also, this is amazing, the enemy of the United States is not China or Russia, it's the Pentagon bureaucracy. Wow. And he said that the national security was threatened and the lives of American service people were at risk because of this incredible accounting scandal, and nobody picked up on it after 9/11. The newspapers had it in them that morning on people's stoops, but everything stopped after that. Rumsfeld never returned to that story. The major newspapers never went back to it, after a year later or anything, and it continues to go on since then, only getting worse. But I was actually told by a guy Jack Armstrong, who was the head of supervisory director of audits at the Office of Management the Office of Inspector General for the Pentagon for a number of years until he retired in 2011. He said, and it's in my article, he said, if the Pentagon wanted to be honest, they would give these financial reports each year to Congress and say, all the numbers in this are garbage.
Right.
I think he actually said complete garbage.
So this can't be happening here. This can't be happening in the United States. This can't be happening with members of Congress who parse every dollar for student loan aid or for relief to immigrant migrants on the border, or to any one of 100 worthy humanitarian causes. But yet the Pentagon can get away with missing trillions. How is this possible?
I mean, I think your listeners need to think about this. If there were a report that that 20 years of budgets for health and human services, or for the EPA, God forbid, or Education Department, Department of Labor, Department of Interior, any of these agencies that conservatives love to hate, if any of those had the kind of impenetrable budgets and fraudulent numbers in them that the Pentagon has, with much smaller numbers involved, the Congress would go ballistic. There would be open public hearings, televised hearings. There'd be calls for the heads of the department secretaries or agency heads. And, there would be calls for a criminal investigation by the Justice Department. But with the Pentagon, where this is known to have been going on for decades, there's not even any hearings on it. I mean, look at the House, where we had people like Beto O'Rourke and Tulsi Gabbard on those committees, on the Armed Services committees in Congress, and not a peep out of them saying, well, what are these fake numbers? How can you have trillions of dollars listed in assets and liabilities for an Army budget that's only $140 billion in total? They don't say anything about it. They don't say, how can we... The real question is, how can we reasonably make decisions about your budget request for $730 billion for 2020 if the budget, the financial report for the prior year that you submitted accompanying it for your spending during the fiscal year 2019 is full of fake numbers and it can't be audited by 1,000 top-ranked Wall Street auditors? That's the question that should be asked and doesn't get asked.
So the guest that preceded you was Francis Boyle. I'm sure you know his work. International.
Very well.
Yes, a great guy. And we were making the case for Bolton and Pompeo, kind of starting to fabricate and falsify the case for war with what Francis Boyle calls the Persian Gulf of Tonkin. America needs another war. So we're now picking a fight with Iran. Professor Boyle thought that maybe it was because of, when we were looking at motive, that because of the Persian Gulf's oil and gas reserves meant so much for Europe and India. My own personal belief is that the military-industrial complex needs another war to stay in business. And again, when you look at these discrepancies of trillions of dollars, I tend to believe that we need to make the case for war because we need to be at war. That's the engine of our economy. War is the engine of our economy. It's what we've been exporting ever since World War II. Let's talk about some of the tricks that the Department of Defense plays, and even within their own Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Defense, these tricks are played. And I'll give you an example. When an account discrepancy occurs that can't be traced, it's customary to make what's called an undocumentable adjustment, and you alluded to it before. And this is similar to when your checkbook balance is off by, say, a few dollars. You add or subtract that amount to make everything balance with the bank. In 1999, the amount that the Pentagon adjusted was 8 times the defense budget for that year, and it was 1/3 greater than the entire federal budget for that year. How is this possible? This can't be happening here.
Yeah, that's right. I actually called, before I did this story, I called the over just 1 year's worth of these numbers. I think it was $6.5 trillion that year. And I called the Inspector General's office, and that I was actually told that I'm trying to find the piece in the article. I should have looked for it ahead of time.
Yeah, that 6.5 trillion, by the way, that you're referring to was just for the Army. Just for that branch of service,
which only had something like $140 billion budget that year. It's the largest unit within the Pentagon, but the spokeswoman that I talked to said, well, it's normal in accounting in the for example in the in looking at the books where the numbers don't quite match on both sides of the ledger, to make adjustments. And so she gave an example of where she said, so for instance, when we have a budget item that's out of whack by $100 billion, we just make an adjustment like that, actually accountants do that, but it has to be less than 1% of the total, is what accountants told me, to make those kind of adjustments.
Right.
Yeah. For our members of our audience who want to look this up, Google this up. Again, this accounting term is called undocumentable adjustments. And in 2015, the report missing by the office.
Unsupported ledger entries is what they call it.
Okay, $6.5 trillion in 2015 just for the Army, and using public data from federal databases. Mark Skidmore, professor of economics at Michigan State University, found that, and get this, hold on to your hats, 21 trillion in unsupported adjustments had been reported by the Department of Defense between 1998 and 2015. 21 trillion. So if you don't think war is a business, if you don't think it's a good business, if you don't think we need another war with Iran or with whomever, think again.
And then,
it's what we do.
But I want to stress that, Mark and I have a little disagreement here, because Mark says he doesn't know whether some of that might be, a significant amount of that might be secret money flowing to the Pentagon. I absolutely don't believe that to be the case, because for two reasons. I'm sure there's some secret money, and I'll tell you how it can happen. Because of these fake numbers, these plugs in the budget, really easily. But if it were trillions, and also Mark admits that that 21 trillion is on the asset and on the liability side, and so it could be much, much, much smaller in terms of an imbalance that actually might be could conceivably be real money, right? So, but the fakeness of it means that what does happen at the Pentagon is that they are clearly violating the Constitution each year in shifting money that isn't spent at the end of the year. That's what's called 1 year money. Like, for instance, all the contingency funds for war in Afghanistan and Somalia and Iraq and stuff. That's 1 year money. If it's not spent, it's supposed to be returned to the Treasury. And it doesn't happen. It gets shifted over into, they call it nippering. That's another Pentagon term. They nipper it over into another budget somewhere, and they make it 5 year money, which is the kind of thing that's used in like weapons contracts and things that take longer than a year to complete. And then it vanishes. And they were doing that illegally. And then this year, the Federal Accounting Standards Board, which is the equivalent of the FASB for the private industry, recommended that they be allowed to do that with classified budget items. So the CIA, the DIA, the ATF, and all of those groups that have classified parts of their budget are being told that they can fake where the money is. They can move it around and not tell anybody. And that budget rule after going through a comment period, was approved. So now it's legal for the Pentagon to nipper money and hide it. And since the Pentagon is mostly classified, there's a lot of money that can be moved around and hidden.
Right. So tell me this, answer this as well. So let's talk about audit technology. We know that the IRS has invested billions of dollars in upgrading to more efficient technologies in order to become audit ready. I know that personally. I was an investigator for 3 different grand juries, and I got audited for the stipend I was paid and mileage reimbursement, which amounted to next to nothing, maybe less than 5% of what I made that year. All right.
Yeah.
And
unions get audited every year, and they get called on the carpet for not having the number of people written at a table when they deduct the meals and stuff. But businesses don't typically get audited like that.
So the Pentagon has also made tens of billions of dollars to upgrade to more efficient technology to become "quote unquote" audit ready. But many of these new systems have failed and have been scrapped. Why?
Well, they've actually claimed that the reason they can't be audited is because they have so many legacy systems, believe it or not. And, they've been making that argument for over 20 years, back to the years when we were using K-Pros for our computers. And so for them to claim that over really the 30 years since Congress passed what was called the CFO Act, requiring all agencies to be auditable. Every other agency in government is now auditable, but not the Pentagon, and they're still claiming legacy. I mean, in all the money that they get, they could have bought Watsons to do it for each branch of the service. I mean, there's no limit to how much they can spend. If they wanted to do this, they could do it, but they don't want to. And I had named people in my story saying that clearly the Pentagon doesn't want to be auditable and has resisted it and is still resisting it.
Hey, David, we have a question via a caller. Jordan, our engineer, is going to talk to you about that right now.
Yeah, we had a caller who called in, wanted, first of all, their comment was that this is all very important, but they were concerned how you were going to get more visibility, how you're going to get the word out there about everything that you're talking about. And the second part of their question was, there was recently a vote in Congress where funding was taken back from Saudi Arabia, I believe. And she was wondering, is some of this misappropriation of funds or disappearance of funds when money gets withdrawn and they find a circuitous route to fund things anyway, and then it's considered disappeared or missing? Or so that was the 2 parts of the question. One was just to say this is great information. It needs more visibility and more dissemination. And the second part was, when they deny funds for military things, does it get circuited around?
Well, I think that it's incumbent on, I'll give you an example of what happened. We had this cover story in The Nation. Originally, The Nation was a little skittish about the piece, and they were suggesting maybe we hold it until February or March and get a little more reporting on it. And I said, I want this story out right after the audit failure is announced on November 15th, because I was afraid, to be honest with you, that as soon as the audit failure was announced and reported in the Times and the Washington Post, both of which have big investigative reporting teams, that they would sick their reporting teams on the Pentagon to find out why it was unauditable, why the audit was a complete failure. And I didn't want to get scooped, because I figured they'd find out, about the plugs and about the fake numbers, and, my story that I spent 5 months on would be left in the dust. So I said to The Nation, I want this story out. And they said, okay, well, we'll put it up online. And then what they did, they put it up online. It turned into the most read article in The Nation that year in terms of hits. Yep. And they had decided they were going to run it online and not make it a cover story as it was intended, and instead they ran it as their cover in December because it was obviously so in demand as an online piece. So it ran both online on the 27th of November and a cover in December. Kudos to the nation. But I was then overwhelmed with calls for 3 weeks. I couldn't get anything done because I was being asked to be on all kinds of radio interviews like this one in the alternative media, and I'm including there even grudgingly calling it alternative. NPR was on the takeaway, which gave it an 11-minute, very well done, very well edited interview that got a lot of attention, but only there. I didn't get a single call from a mainstream electronic media news organization producer or from an editor or reporter in the mainstream corporate press. None. Not one person called to say. And I had a classmate, Steve Croft at 60 Minutes, who I sent it to, and I got no calls back from 60 Minutes. I got no calls back from any news organization. It just was completely ignored. So I think what has to happen to break out of the alternative media is that the American public that's listening to this show and listens to all the other shows that this was on around the country should take it on themselves to write and phone their editors of their local papers, of the national papers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, all those places, and say, where's the story about the Pentagon's massive economic fraud?
Dave, we have about 2 minutes.
I want to jump in there quick.
I want people to know how to get in touch.
I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, Dave. I'm here at Independent Media, KMUD. I believe in independent media. We make the trip, you don't know, but from a long ways away to do this show. And we make significant investment in our podcasts and our website and our blog, etc. But I'm going to break up this show into 2 parts. First part, Francis Boyle. Second part, you. And I'm going to take your part and I'm going to send it I'm going to make a disc. I'm going to send it to the Congressional Budget Office, and I'm going to send it to the Government Accountability Office, care of Senator Feinstein, where a couple of former interns for the show are now working. And I'm going to ask, where are the congressional hearings?
This can't be happening.
This can't be happening here.
This can't be happening. Dave Lindorff is our guest for the last 30 minutes. He is an American investigative reporter, a columnist for Counterpunch, and a contributor to Businessweek, The Nation, Extra, and Salon.com. And please go to thiscan'tbehappening.net.
Dave, final word. You get the final minute.
Yeah, the other thing would be Congress. I mean, everybody's got a Congress member, and it's an election year coming up. We should be demanding that our members of Congress ask why something that accounts for 57% of our discretionary budget has no accountability whatsoever because their budgets are incomprehensible.
Very good. That is our show today. Thank you so much, Dave. We got to have you back. And
Thank you, brother. Thank you for your work.
Very good. Well, you've been listening to Heroes and Patriots. I'm Mary Massey along with John Sakowicz. Please go to our new website, heroespatriots.org, and tune in next time. We are always here the first Thursday of the month
at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting Redway Community Radio, your public radio station, KMUD.